So today we're going to read chapters 8 and 9 of The False Prince. I hope you enjoy it. Errol was calling my name when I returned to the room, sweaty and tired. I hadn't been gone long, just enough to have a look over Connor's grounds for myself. Still, I wondered how long he'd been calling me. "Must have fallen asleep," I called back to him, splashing some water with my hand. "What do you need?" "Your water must be cold by now," he said. "May I refill it?" The water was cold, but it was also perfectly clean, and I was filthier than when he'd left me. "The water is fine," I said, undressing as quickly and quietly as I could. "I won't be much longer." "The other boys left their baths long ago." "Yes, but they were probably cleaning themselves while I was sleeping. Give me a few moments." I dove into the water and scrubbed everything that would show outside my clothes. A thick stack of new clothes from Errol waited for me beside the tub. They were gentlemen's clothes and probably cost Connor a fair amount of silver to purchase for all three of us. Mine had a linen shirt that laced up the front somehow, a soft leather half-sleeved vest with carved bone buttons, long linen pants, and a pair of calf-high boots. I didn't think much of my skin would show. This was only my first bath, because after I emerged from the room, Errol inspected my arms above the sleeves and observed that I still smelled like an orphanage. He insisted on scrubbing me the second time. "The water is freezing," he said. "Do you like your bath this way?" "It's colder now," I said grumpily, and I never said I preferred it, only that it was fine. Errol's gentle manners were not reflected in his bathing assistants. It surprised me how much dirt came off the second time. While he busied himself with a brush on the bottom of my feet, I looked at my fingernails. "I don't remember them ever being this color," I said, then yanked my foot away. "That tickles. Are you finished yet? I don't like having a man help me with my bath." Errol grinned. "Shall I have a woman sent in?" I laughed and told Errol I wouldn't need anyone's help for my future baths. Obviously, Master Connor has a different standard of clean than the orphanage did. Now that I know you want the entire body washed, I'll make the necessary adjustments. After we finished, I sent Errol out while I redressed. I had to admit that he'd done a good job. It was possible I'd never been so clean. "Where are my old clothes?" I asked Errol after I finished dressing. "Off to be burnt, I guess. They're not fit for much else." "Get them," I said firmly, and then added, "Just as they were before, Errol, exactly as they were." Errol considered that for a moment, then said, "I can get them back, I suppose." "If you do, I'll see that you get a silver coin for your service." Errol tilted his head. "Where would you get it?" "That's a small detail and my concern, not yours. But it would buy months off your debt to Connor." I widened my arms. "These clothes aren't mine, and they're not me. I suspect I'll want those other clothes back in 2 weeks." Errol shrugged. "I'll see what I can do. Now come, the master's expecting you at supper." Connor had bathed and shaved as well. He cleaned up nicely, now looking more like a noble and less like a road-weary traveler. Roden and Tobias were already seated when I walked in. This small dining room appeared to be reserved for everyday meals and more intimate affairs. It was clearly designed to impress whoever ate here with an idea of Connor's wealth. I couldn't help but do the math on how much a clever thief might earn from stealing a polished silver fork, or a gold-rimmed goblet, or a single crystal hanging in beads from the sconces on the wall. "Sit, please," Connor said, motioning to the plate on his left. Tobias was at his right, and Roden was beside Tobias. Roden was clearly distressed that I had been seated closer to Connor than him. As soon as I sat, servants began bringing in the food. They started with cheese as soft as butter and fruit in the prime of ripeness. At the orphanage, we got the leftovers from the kitchens of the wealthy after they were too wilted or brown to be served at their tables, usually within minutes of the scraps turning to mold. Connor was served first, but he waited for the rest of us to be served before he began. Although I was served second, I assumed I had to follow the same guideline. It was a horrible temptation to ignore Connor's example and begin eating. My senses were overwhelmed by glorious smells on my plate and others coming from the kitchen. "Do you eat like this all the time?" I asked enthusiastically. "All the time," Connor said. "Would you like a life of this luxury?" "This exceeds any expectation I might have had for my life," I answered. "It's a humble meal compared to a king's feast," Connor said. But who'd need a king's feast if they had all this? Roden asked as his plate was served. Then he looked at Connor, knowing he'd made a mistake, but not sure exactly what it was. He searched for the words to correct himself and failed. Tobias took his opening. I'd need a king's feast. A girl reached over my shoulder and set a bowl of burnt orange-colored soup in front of me. She had dark brown hair pulled into a single braid down her back. She wasn't necessarily beautiful, but something about her was definitely interesting. Her eyes fascinated me the most, warm and brown, but haunted, maybe afraid. She frowned when she caught me looking at her and returned to serving the others. Thank you, I said, getting her attention again. What kind of soup is this? I waited for her answer to my question, but none came. Maybe in Connor's home, the servants weren't permitted to speak at his table. I turned away quickly, hoping I hadn't got her into trouble. Connor prattled on, telling us what we could expect to eat for dinner that evening. Crisp bread still steaming from the oven, glazed roasted duck with meat so tender it could be cut with a spoon, fruit pudding chilled from an underground cooler. I heard him, but continued to watch the girl as she refilled drinks for each of us. When she leaned to refill Tobias's cup, another servant bumped her with his shoulder and a little water splashed onto Tobias's lap. Connor glared at her, irritated. I opened my mouth to defend her, but she handed him another napkin and hurried from the room before anything could be said. When we were all washed up, Connor picked up the spoon at the top of his plate and said, "This is your soup spoon. It is for the soup and only for the soup." Following his direction, I grabbed my spoon, trying to hold it the same way he did. It was an awkward, uncomfortable position. Maybe gentlemen had to feed themselves this way. Poverty-stricken orphans didn't. I was used to holding my spoon the same way I might grip an axe. "You eat with your left hand?" Connor asked me. "That's unacceptable. Can you do it with your right?" "Can you do it with your left?" I countered. Connor sounded offended. "No. Yet you asked me to switch to my right." "Just do it." I switched hands, but made no attempt to imitate Connor's delicate grip with his hand. Instead, with my axe grip, I went straight for the soup. "No, Sage," Connor said. "Scoop the soup into your spoon by pushing the liquid away from you like this," he demonstrated, and added, "That way, if you spill, it will go onto the table, not onto your lap." The last bowl of soup I'd eaten had been consumed by my holding both sides of the bowl and drinking it as if from a cup. My right hand was sloppy, and as soon as Connor looked away, I switched back to my left. He noticed, but said nothing. Connor corrected Roden on how to hold his spoon. "It's not a hammer, boy," he lectured Tobias on leaning over his bowl. "Bring the food to your mouth, not the mouth to your food." But he said nothing else to me about manners. I suspected he'd given up. Following the soup, we had some bread and more cheese. Connor demonstrated the use of the cheese slicer and bread knives. I thought both of those were obvious, so I didn't pay much attention. Roden and Tobias seemed captivated. The girl who caught my attention before returned to clear our soup bowls and the bread and cheese, while other servants brought us the main course. She frowned at me again, which bothered me because I didn't see what I possibly could have done so soon to irritate her this much. "I'm already full," Tobias said. "It's considered rude to say that," Connor said. "A host plans to serve his guests throughout the entire meal and does not want to think that he is forcing half his meal down their throats." Tobias apologized and said his dinner smelled good, which Connor also seemed to think was a little rude. I didn't think Tobias meant to be rude. It's just that the way he said certain things made him sound haughty. I was plenty hungry even after the first 2 courses. It had been nearly 2 days since I'd eaten anything substantial, and months since I'd ever eaten eaten enough to consider myself full. Food is considered a luxury in Carthaginian orphanages. They operate on whatever money an orphan inherited upon the deaths of his parents, which is inevitably a little more than the shirt on his back after debts were settled. Private donations come in from time to time by wealthy citizens hoping to buy forgiveness for their favorite sins. And, like what had just happened to the 3 of us, an orphan was sometimes purchased from the orphanage by a wealthy family to be a servant until his debt was worked off. Since there was so little to eat, we learned to eat fast and to eat selfishly, which is why I hadn't understood Mrs. Terweldy's anger about my stealing that roast yesterday. It was meant for all of us. The final course was dessert, a cherry tart with cinnamon and sugar sprinkled on it. The same girl returned who had served me before, but this time I gave her no extra notice. Even if she had difficulties here, I had plenty of my own to worry about. I needed to focus on Connor, who had yet to reveal the worst of his intentions for us. "Leave the room now," Connor ordered all his servants. "I won't need you again until we finished our supper." When the last of the servants closed the doors, Connor set his knife and fork down and clasped his hands together. "We've come to it at last," he said, looking at us carefully. "I am ready to tell you my plan." An hour seemed to pass before Connor continued. When he finally did, it was in hushed tones, as if he expected the servants' ears were pressed against the doors of our room. "Some of you may believe you've already guessed my plan," he began, "but I assure you it is not treason. Indeed, in a roundabout way, it may prevent treason in King Ecbert's court. Carthia is on the brink of civil war, and very few citizens are aware of it. A major change is coming to this country." "What is it?" Tobias asked. We all had that same question, but Connor's glare reflected his irritation at being interrupted. "I will come to that in a moment," he said. "Do you remember what I told you about Veldergrath? He has long planned for this day, and even now has begun to amass those loyal to him, so that he can force the rest of us to give him the king's crown. But other regents are also aspiring to the crown. They are quietly gathering their supporters. In 2 weeks, war will erupt in Carthia. It will split the country along lines of loyalty or alliances, and may pit families against each other, friends against friends, and town against town. Thousands will inevitably die in that war. Alvinia, the country of your origin, Sage, is watching closely, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They are hungry for our rich farmlands and the minerals our mountains provide. When Carthia is weakest and most divided, Alvinia will strike and swallow up Carthia with the force of a tidal wave. Alvinia is a cesspool at best. In a generation, will be no better." Connor tilted his head at me. "Don't pretend to look horrified at my words, Sage. You know my description of Alvinia is true." "It is," I quietly agreed. "Then you hope to prevent the civil war," Tobias said. "But you said yourself that you could never hope to become king." "Do you remember this morning when I asked how many heirs King Ecbert has?" Connor said. "What was your answer, Sage?" "2, but as Tobias pointed out, I was wrong. There is only the crown Prince Darius still alive. Ecbert's younger son was lost at sea." "The younger son was named Jaron. Since coming to court, I've been told many stories about him, some of which could not possibly be true with the castle still standing in one piece." "I heard he set fire to the throne room as a child," Tobias said. "And he challenged the king of Menendwall to a duel of honor when he was 10 years old," Rodin added. "He lost, of course, but not by much, so the story goes." "We've all heard the stories," I snapped. "What's the point?" "Let me finish," Connor said. 4 years ago, when he was nearly 11 years of age, Jaron was to be sent north to the country of Bimar, always a friend of Carthia. He was sent there not only to be educated abroad, but frankly, to stop embarrassing the king and queen. However, on his way, his ship was attacked by pirates. There were no survivors. Pieces of the boat washed ashore for months, but Jaron's body was never found. "I did hear about this once," I said. "Alvinia was accused of hiring the pirates. If King Ecbert had any proof, he would have gone to war." "At least you know about your own country," Connor said. "It probably was Alvinia. Piracy is certainly their style. Some say the pirates have more power there than the Alvinia king. But Ecbert couldn't rule out the possibility that as a border country to Alvinia, Gailen had hired them. Both countries have easy access to the waters where Jaron's ship went down." "My father followed that news carefully," I said. "He didn't want war, no matter what else was sacrificed." "If he is still alive, my father would have been honored to fight on behalf of Carthia," Tobias said. "I'm not the son of a coward." It would have felt good to defend my father's honor by punching Tobias in the face. But although my father was not a coward, he would have avoided being in a war at any cost. That fact was one of the last things he and I ever fought about. 3 regents have made the trip to Azel, the seaport town from which Prince Jaron's ship launched. They seek any proof of his death, or his life. "His life?" Rodin sat forward in his chair. "Is it possible Jaron's alive?" "A body was never found, Rodin. But if Prince Jaron were alive, then he would be next in line for the throne. Not Vildergrath or any other noble could claim it, and Carthia would be saved from civil war. Then Alvinia would not attack. But it's irrelevant. It is irrelevant, Tobias said. Egbert and Aaron rule now. Eventually, Crown Prince Darius will take the throne. Connor leaned in closer to us. And this is the greatest secret of your lives thus far. They are dead. All three of the royal family. The few of us who know the truth have said the royal family is on a diplomatic mission to Gailin. Meanwhile, their bodies secretly lie far beneath the castle. We sat there, beyond shock and too horrified to breathe. The news that not just one, but all three royals were dead was impossible to bear. My stomach grew queasy at the thought of it, but I pushed those feelings down. How did they die? I whispered. Murder. We believe they were administered some sort of poison at supper. They never awoke. Any suspects? Roden asked. Connor dismissed his question with a wave of his hand. Don't be naive. Egbert had many enemies, and frankly, I wouldn't trust most of his friends. I believe all three family members were intended victims, clearing the path for a noble to become king. So was it Vildergrath? I asked. A lot of regents suspect him, but there's no evidence of it, Connor said. We shall see who puts themselves forward to be king, and then judge. And you hope to find Prince Jarin and stop the nobles from fighting over the throne, Tobias said. Not exactly, Connor said. Prince Jarin is long dead, and I can prove it. How? I asked. Connor smiled. I'm afraid for now I must ask you to trust me on that. It's a secret. It's my secret and mine alone. However, since the regents are unaware of my proof, their trip to Izel is only to end any official doubt before another king is chosen. That is where you come in. Because, you see, many Carthaginians have small hopes that Jarin is alive. Nobody has seen him for nearly 4 years. He would be 14 today, about the same age as you boys. Surely the three of you have noticed certain physical similarities between one another. He paused a moment and his smile widened. You also have similarities in appearance to Prince Jarin as he might look today. My plan is simple, really. I intend to convince the court that Prince Jarin is one of you.